Welcome to Superlative. I am your podcast host, Ariel Adams. In each episode, you will meet someone who has inspired or takes inspiration from today's wristwatch industry. Every week, let's dive deep into the world of crafting exotic timepieces, from the people who dream them up to the people who dream of them. It's time to get started and meet today's guest. Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the Superlative Podcast. My guest today is Robin Tallendier. He's the co-founder of Atelier Wen. Robin, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and thanks for welcoming me on your podcast. I'm super stoked to be here today. Hi, everyone.
Absolutely. There's a lot to talk about, and I think we'll sort of start with, you're a European person from the watch industry that went to work in China, and then you started a watch company that is an interesting combination of celebrating, I guess, Chinese culture and heritage, but really sort of a watch in the European style. Would you agree that's sort of what you did, or how would you define what you're attempting to do with Atelier Wen, and especially when you founded it?
Yeah, for sure. So I think Atelier Wen is really like a watch brand which is aiming to celebrate both Chinese culture and craftsmanship. And I think the European side of it, this one is one that is we don't really try to have on the product per se, but it's more like on the company itself. So we are two French guys who happen to be like very linked to China, and we want to share our appreciation of the culture and the craftsmanship through those watches to the world. So the Western kind of facet to it appears, I believe, due to our two backgrounds. But what we aim to do with the products, though, is with the watches, is really celebrating the local culture and craftsmanship in a nutshell.
I guess the reason that I'm bringing it up, and the reason why I think it's so important as part of a distinguishing factor of the brand, is it's the exact opposite of what you tend to see. What you tend to see is Chinese watch companies which attempt to look European in the sense that they're celebrating European-style watches, often with European-style names, and even sometimes branding. And you, recognizing that there was a large amount of interest in watches in China, decided to do something very different. And I think that that's worth pointing out. Would you agree that did you know that you were doing something unique at the time, or did you learn later that this was not the standard approach?
No, for sure. We knew that we were going in the sort of complete opposite direction of what was the trend when we started the company. As you correctly said, there's a lot of watch companies in China, and I usually try to go for a very sort of Western identity. The reason being that the bulk of the local watch market is still heavily trusted and led by Western companies and mostly Swiss and German ones. So they see that the demand sort of revolves around that, and therefore they try to emulate this in order to capture part of that demand. Putting made in China in the spotlight and being proud of it and celebrating it. And besides made in China, also sort of ideated in China is something that no one was doing because, there is, truth to be said, quite a negative bias around Chinese products. So you don't start at zero. You sort of start at -5, and therefore there's more efforts to be done in order to convince people that, hey, look, those are interesting watches. But for us, it's really our thinking was not let's create a watch company and then what's the concept. It was more we are both really into Chinese culture. We want to showcase that. Myself, I was into Chinese watches. My co-founder, Wilfried, was born and raised in Hong Kong all his life, then also lived in mainland China. So very attached to that. And we're okay, how are we going to show this? And watches was the perfect medium because, I had this interest, those connections and whatnot. But yeah, we were aware that this was definitely not the norm, and it still is not the norm.
I have to talk about that more and allow me to sort of pontificate about it, because I love that you did it. I immediately understood from the moment that you founded Atelier when, really what the goal was. But I think that discussing the context is really important. Let's begin with the fact that Asia is where the perception of inexpensive watches are made, even though the reality is that a lot of the Swiss stuff has parts made in China. There's still this perception that stuff made in China isn't as good. The Chinese market itself, in the higher end, tends to overwhelmingly prefer goods from Europe. They like European or foreign brands. There's not always a high level of trust in some of the local brands. Of course, a lot of the fakes, come from China. So there's a lot of prejudice that is not the entire picture, but it is a legacy prejudice, especially amongst the European watch brands, and it's so I think impactful that it's actually translated the Chinese market, that they themselves on a luxury basis only recently, very recently, have started to be open-minded to buying luxury Chinese watches. Would you or disagree about the sort of taste of luxury Chinese watch consumers, at least when it comes to the preference for European goods?
Oh no, I fully agree with you. It's definitely spot on, and I think this comes down to a few factors. The first one is that when the country opened, like you had Western brands going in there, and they started heavily like marketing their watches, and they did a really good job. Basically, they built up the brand equity really well over there. I think it's one of the few examples industry wise of like foreign industries like doing like super well for a very long period of time in China. So they did this fantastic job well. And then the second one is that, well, as well, when the country opened up, it was like still like fairly underdeveloped, and you had the first foreign companies, like at least for manufacturing, coming in there, and that was mostly like cost driven. So they were making like goods that were like more affordable, that were cheaper. So that perception also sort of remained that goods made in China or originating from China would be cheaper ones. So I think if you combine the two of them, that brings you at least partly why most of the domestic Chinese customers like to prefer Western goods. We see some evolutions though, that being said. So when we launched the company and we tried to venture into mainland China, we worked with like a big e-commerce player over there, and we would see that there was like a price threshold over which they wouldn't buy, like most of the people at least wouldn't buy Chinese watches. And fast forward to 2023, we see that the threshold has increased a bit, not too much, but a bit. So there's definitely like some kind of like upward trends. What I find encouraging though is that if you look at other verticals, other industries, this movement is happening faster. So if you look, for instance, as like, I don't know, IT and smartphones, you see that like high-end domestic brands are doing quite well. If you look at the car industry, like high-end electric car companies over there are also doing well and are sort of like accepted. So hopefully too, like this is like a trend that we will see within the watch industry.
I remember a couple of years ago when they changed some of the laws to make it much more difficult to purchase luxury goods overseas and then bring them in without paying the luxury tax. The government, and I believe Xi Jinping himself, he started to encourage Chinese people to buy Chinese-made goods. There seemed to be a push to do more of that, to consume locally. Was that an effective thing from your vantage point? And was there also a push by the government to consider Chinese crafts, or was it mainly for mass-produced things?
Yeah, so you had those policies, you had like Made in China 2025, you have sort of like more like duties and tariffs on like certain goods. Also, you had the huge like anti-corruption crackdown that sort of led to a big drop in the conceptions of those like foreign-made luxury goods. But honestly, on our and it had like absolutely, almost zero impact. I feel that for luxury goods, those goods which rely heavily on like brand equity, brand story, making people dream, those well, I believe tend to be the last ones that get affected by those kind of policies, because effectively those are the ones which are the furthest away from being commodities. But when we were at the ideation stage, so when we were thinking about the Taiwan, one of our big assumptions was that mainland China would be a big market for us, because we could see like all those macro trends that you described, and we were like, well, there's no aspirational watch brand over there. I mean, you do have watch brands which have existed for quite some time. Seagull dates back to 1955, for instance, but they were priced at like much more entry-level sort of positionings. So we saw this kind of void in the market, and we thought that would be a big driver for growth. It turns out it wasn't at all. But yeah, that was part of the big hypothesis we had at the beginning.
So where is the brand officially located? You're in Paris, but as a brand, it's designed to have an Asian element to it. Where is it located, actually?
Yeah, for sure. So actually, we created the brand in Hong Kong. We stayed in Hong Kong full time for 2 years, branding it over there, and then due to that mistake of venturing in mainland China, we basically had to pause operations. I went back to France and I took a quote-unquote regular job in a private equity fund in Paris. And Wilfried, my co-founder, went to Singapore and started some other ventures. And during this time, we thought about what to do next. So now the team, I would say, is fairly spread out. You do have three persons in Singapore, one person in Shenzhen in the south of China to oversee the supply chain, and eventually myself in Paris, which I believe from a business point of view makes absolutely zero sense. But it is in a way a kind of result of everything that had happened before. But then I go to China and to Asia super frequently. So maybe I'm in Paris 50% of the time, and the rest I'm just over there.
Obviously, the last several years in China has been tumultuous. If you're interested in luxury sales, yeah. You said that going into China was a mistake in a sense. Was it because of the timing, or are you actually doing better business outside of China, celebrating Chinese culture than in China right now for a variety of reasons?
There's a lot of factors, honestly. So, at the core, you have the fact that the bulk of the customer is not so fussed about the idea of having a high-end or at least a premium domestically made and branded watch. So that's the first difficulty. The second one, and which was a huge one for us as well, was the cost of marketing, which is extremely high in China. In a sense, the marketing channels are widely different there compared to the rest of the world. So all your Instagram, Facebook, Google ads, YouTube ads, all your big medias the ones we know, a blog to watch, linking and whatnot. This in a sense that doesn't really exist over there. So you have to use their local channels, meaning that it's as if you were running two companies at the same time. And there, when you do targeting, it's definitely not granular at all. So it's not like doing ads on Meta or YouTube. It's a very an-advanced kind of targeting, meaning that the people that you reach, they are usually not so qualified or not at all of a match. And you pay higher to reach those people. So you pay higher to reach them, and they don't really convert. So it means that in very crude terms, your customer acquisition cost is extremely high. The third reason why for us it didn't work out in China then was that it was pre-COVID and physical retail was still a very, very important aspect of selling watches. Unlike Europe, where usually the demand in one country tends to be concentrated in one city. So if, for instance, you take France, you're in Paris and you're basically addressing 80% of the market. I guess you could say the same with London and the UK. In China, if you really want to address the market well, you need to be in 9 cities. And in all of those 9 cities, you have sort of big city at the city level, local champions. So it's not I don't know, in Europe where you can be working with watches of Switzerland and being sold everywhere, or pretty much the same in the US. There you need to strike deals with those kind of 9 big local players. So it's a bit tricky. It's not very easy. So for us, we just therefore decided to completely discard the physical retail, but then the goods were expensive. People were not used to buying those so much online, the prejudice, the customer acquisition cost being super high. All that combined meant that it wasn't really like successful to be selling over there.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like China not only requires mastery of many markets, but there's also many gatekeepers. It seems that that in itself is a huge barrier. But I'm sure that there was a couple of people, of course, he did sell to. And my question is, what was the response from people in China? How did they like it? Do you feel like it was mission accomplished? Did they understand what you were going for?
So we in this journey we sort of like undercovered like some segments which had like a really good resonance with what we were trying to do. So those guys really liked it, but they pretty much tended to be Chinese individuals who had either lived abroad, studied abroad, worked abroad, or who were born abroad and then who were returnees. And I feel that maybe having this kind of double cultural exposure made them value the local culture more. And in a way, I can sort of like relate and understand. So, for instance, from age 0 to 18, I was living in France, born and raised there. I didn't really question much the idea, okay, what's your identity? Where do you come from? Like, what's your country and whatnot? But then, like, for my studies, I moved to the UK and to China. And then that's really the moment when I started being like, oh, okay, like, how do you define yourself? Where do you come from? And how do you appreciate this other culture? You're sort of like immersed in. And I feel, maybe it's sort of the same that happened to those like Chinese individuals. They had lived abroad, worked abroad, and they could sort of, maybe like more their own culture and understand more the importance of like celebrating it and like making it visible. So those people really liked it, but then it's sort of hard to reach them. So we had some ways. We were partnering up with some local communities like Shanghai Watch Gang. We did like a few events. But still, those are like one-offs and one-offs and one-offs. There was no like such consistent way, repeatable way of getting in touch with them.
It's very, very hard. But it sounds like you succeeded in getting the enthusiasts, even though they were difficult to court all the time. You successfully made a good enthusiast watch. Talk a little bit about that. I want to talk more about China, but what are your watches like? I mean, I know them, but maybe explain to them to people. And who do you mean to have wear them? Like, help position your watches right now in the market of other watches today.
Yeah, for sure. So our watches are really like mostly targeted to watch aficionados and watch collectors. I think this is also a byproduct of myself in the first place, being one of those people. So in a sense, how it started was like, okay, what would I like to see in a watch? And then going to forums like Watch Music or Forum à Montre, which is the French equivalent to that, to discuss the project, to talk to the aficionados, to get their feedback. But because those ideas were mainly exposed to those kind of demographics, then the watch has been sort of like heavily shaped to appeal to those people. And still to this day, I mean, that's the case. It's a watch which, I mean, maybe it's going to sound bad, but maybe it's a bit like geeky in how it's made. It's all those kind of like small details and features that watch collectors tend to like. So if we take like our first model, which was called Porcelain Odyssey, and which you covered and reviewed, there was a lot of such nice features. So the dial was made of porcelain, hence the name. We had like a very nice set of like heat blued hands, and we had like a super deep embossed case back. And those are the things that watch collectors tend to care about. I think like high street buyers will mainly be attracted to the brands, to the kind of like general public recognition, to the celebrity endorsements, but those are not really our targets. Our targets are really like watch collectors. So in our current model Perception, I mean, we followed more or less the same recipe. Instead of a porcelain dial, you have a handmade guilloche one, which is really cool. We didn't go for 316L steel, but 904. You have a semi-display case bag, but still like that deeply embossed figures, and a lot of like small like nifty features that I believe appeal to watch collectors, and it seems to appeal to them.
Now, as a French person living in China, What did you admire about the culture, at least aesthetically, that made it seem like a really great inspiration for a watch brand? Because it makes sense, and obviously it's an incredibly rich culture with thousands of years of aesthetic history. But what did you see in it personally?
Yeah, so personally, what I really liked was the whole like craft aspect. The fact that you had like so many like various crafts, which were widely different and very numerous. And in a way, it somehow reminded me of France, where we have also those hundreds of craftsmanships, some of them which are nearly extinct, some which are still over there, some that need to be rediscovered. So in China, that's really the thing I liked. You would go to like those provinces, those cities, and it makes something like really unique that you only find there. Maybe it's just like a variant of like a sort of like more mainstream craft, but I thought that was really, really interesting. The richness and wealth of that. So for me, that was like the main draw in terms of like what I liked in the culture. But also because, I came into that as the watch guy. I was obviously like very drawn to the aspect of Chinese watchmaking, and I've been collecting vintage Chinese watches since I'm like 14, because those were the only ones I could afford back then. And that's also something that I found really cool, like, to work with those watchmakers, to those big names, to those like, people like really involved in the watch industry and to do something together. So also that was a fairly big draw for me.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So you've gone to events and things like that. And, before people meet you, they see Atelier Wen, they see the brand is sort of inspired by, Chinese culture, and they meet you, a French guy. Are there any people that are surprised that you are maybe not Chinese?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Quite a few people actually think that Wen is a guy, and that there's this one guy who created an atelier, a workshop, and I expect to meet Mr. Wen.
Well, you can understand the confusion.
No, definitely.
Chinese business names are very literal, aren't they?
Yeah, no, they can be. And I remember there was this Japanese journalist I was talking to like on Instagram over the course of a few months, and he was always calling me like Wen-san. And then we met in Geneva, and he really couldn't believe that I was the quote unquote Wen-san, because I didn't really look like Wen-san. No, I think like some people are surprised, but then when we explain the why, they understand. Really, it's, even though, like we're not Chinese, Wilfried, you could debate because he's born and raised in Hong Kong. He has Hong Kong citizenship. He also lived like 5 or 6 years in mainland. So, you could debate, but he's Western, but in identity, he could also be considered as from there. But yeah, then they understand as well the story that, we just really liked it. And we thought it was unfair that it was only centered around negative perceptions, and we wanted to show the side that we fell in love with and that we liked. And then they're like, okay, fair enough. People understand it. I hope.
People who are Chinese and who understand and who grew up in Chinese culture and who understand the brand, what do they recommend maybe that you focus on? Like, are there particularly beautiful or well-regarded pieces of Chinese history or culture that may have not become mainstream yet? Because I'm sure they must have said, Robin, there's this amazing thing you should see. It would look great on a watch style or whatever. Like, talk about some of those things.
Yeah. So sometimes we receive recommendations in terms of craft, but I believe though that it's like there is I don't know how it is in the US, but at least in China, I feel that people are very proud of the area they come from. So, someone from Shanghai, if you ask him or her...
Have you seen our sports fans?
Yeah, maybe it's the same. So you ask someone from Shanghai, like, oh, what's the best city in China? And they will look at you straight in the eyes and be, oh, it's Shanghai. And then you ask them, well, what do you think of Beijing? And they will like trash Beijing, saying like, oh, they have like all the kind of like bad traits that you can have in the world, and that Shanghai is the very best city in China. So usually people that we ask, they tend to recommend the craft from their hometown. and I really like that. So recently we talked to a guy like from Hangzhou, and there it used to be like a center for making gold foil in China, but gold foil by hand. They would receive pieces of gold, and then they would just beat it over the course of many hours to have something extremely thin yet resistant. So we met those guys, and we were like, "Oh, you should use that in one of your watches. It would look really nice. It's much better than gold plating." And yeah, truth to be told, it's interesting. We also met someone from Suzhou. Suzhou is nearby Shanghai, but it's a city which is known for the embroidery, silk embroidery. So also they push to us the idea of like doing silk tiles. So usually it just depends on where the people are from, and then they recommend their local craft. But it's always very interesting because obviously we don't have the knowledge of all the craft over there. I mean, we are very, very far away from that. So it's nice to have people like talk to you about like what is coming from their hometown and why it's interesting. And it's also nice to feel that, despite like the fact that, well, most of them really want like Swiss watches, they still talk very fondly about this heritage piece from where they come from. So that's also sort of like moving / like heartwarming kind of realization.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a different question, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine. You may not. But I've always been curious because, as an American, very often I see Swiss watch brands try to celebrate other countries. When they try to celebrate America, it's kind of like a little cheesy and wonky. Like, of course, they're not American. And then they have even more watches, especially over the last, 10 years or so, 15, 20 years, that are, Swiss watches meant to celebrate Chinese culture. And there's been a bunch of different ways of doing that. Just earlier today, H. Moser and Z came out with their special Chinese calendar that sort of is contrasted with the Gregorian calendar. Interesting watch. My question is, from your perspective, how do Chinese people react when a foreign company tries to make a product specifically appeal to them, right? Because I think a lot of the times they like the European brands because it's trying to be for Europeans or as they see it. But it's a very different thing for a European brand to produce something that they feel is going to appeal to some part of the local Chinese market. Do you have any thoughts on sentiment towards those types of products?
Yeah, no, definitely. Very interesting question. There's many answers to that. First, I will start by saying that, well, a lot of the locals who hear about the brands are like heavily puzzled as to like, why are you guys doing that? You come from the West. Why don't you make like Western watches? That it is what we want as a majority. So a lot of people are puzzled. But I think like, yeah, the local individuals we talk to tend to be quite positive about what we are trying to do. I think it also comes down to the identity of the brand because we don't market ourselves as a Chinese brand. This is something actually that we thought about like very, very early on when we were defining the name. We were still in undergrad with Wilfried and we had this short list of names. And eventually the debate that we had was that, shall we have a full Chinese name? Because in a sense, our watches are going to be fully Chinese, or shall we have a name that is more like sort of cross-cultural? And we went for the second option. So Atelier One, you have Atelier, which is a French word meaning workshop, and eventually Wen, which is a Chinese for Wenhua, which is culture, the culture workshop. But we feel that by having this name also, we are able to really convey clearly our identity. We're not trying to disguise ourselves as a Chinese brand. We're like a French Chinese brand. This is cross-cultural combination. It's a company with like Chinese individuals and French individuals. And now that we're growing a bit, there's also, individuals from other places. But I feel, that by being very clear about who we are as from an identity standpoint and not trying to be like fake Chinese, I think that helps people appreciating what we do. In regards to the design, so those are done like exclusively by like local like Chinese designers because we don't have the pretension of having a fine enough like cultural understanding to make pieces that are really meaningful and not cheesy. And I think what you were mentioning about like those Western watch brands trying to appeal appeal to Chinese customers by making Chinese-looking products. I think this is a very, very delicate exercise. Some people do it really well, but most of the time it just ends up being like very kitsch and not Chinese at all, and it just shows a very superficial understanding.
I mean, look, every year of every zodiac, everything with the number 8. I mean, at some point it gets kind of pedantic, right?
Yeah, and no offense to those brands, but it's very superficial, like if you believe that this is Chinese culture. I mean, it's the same as if some Chinese brands were doing like hamburger watches, marketed to the US. You would say, oh, this is in no way the US culture. This is like just the biggest stereotype. Well, and I think the opposite stands true too. So some brands do it really well, though. I mean, you have examples, like you look at the Blancpain Chinese calendar. I think this is a very interesting watch. You look at the Parmigiani Chinese calendar. I think it's quite cool. But then, you have those like obnoxious and ubiquitous, like year of the whatever editions. This not hugely keen on them, but so to avoid those kind of mistakes and so as not to be kitsch and superficial and stereotypical, we work with Chinese designers, and the ideation process takes an awful long time. We usually spend approx like a year on a design, really going through the concept, refining to make sure that we have something that is like truly Chinese and modern and meaningful and desirable and all that.
Hi, this is Ariel Adams, founder of A Blog to Watch, with a message about eBay. I visit eBay daily and have been relying on eBay to learn about and acquire watches for more than 20 years. Did you know that you can now buy watches directly from brands or their authorized dealers on eBay? Timepieces coveted by watch enthusiasts from brands like Zodiac, Laco, Parallel, and more are part of eBay's Certified by Brand program. Here's how it works. Luxury names are partnering with eBay to bring brand new and pre-owned watches and other luxury accessories directly to you. Certified by Brand includes a minimum 1-year factory warranty for watches and offers an unprecedented selection of new and used watches directly from the source, all with the peace of mind you can expect from eBay. Visit ebay.com/certifiedbybrand for more information. I know that there's a large population of Chinese people around the world, and many of them are watch lovers. Where are you selling more watches? To people who live in Chinese parts of the world, or to ethnically Chinese people who live elsewhere and may have some emotional or familial connection back home, but don't live there? I'm just interested in, sort of maybe one group is more interested in the concept than the other.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something indeed. So we do sell to a lot of collectors who are ethnically Chinese or sort of like ethnically related to China. That is a big bulk of who our audience is. So our biggest market is the US by far. And when we look at who our customers are, I think there's a good proportion of them who are somewhat related to China, be it like American-born Chinese or Chinese individuals who have then immigrated. And actually, we interviewed like quite a few of them because at the beginning we were very puzzled, like why? I mean, we had some hypotheses, but we really wanted to hear that from themselves. And most of the time we would get the same story, especially for like American-born Chinese, when they would tell you that, they are born here, they identify as American, but like when they are kids, they really want to integrate. So obviously they don't want to talk Chinese, they don't want to use their Chinese name, they don't want to eat Chinese food. They really want to be like, all the other kids, like the mainstream. And I mean, that's understandable. Like every kids usually want to integrate. And then they behave like that and they go to uni, they start working and whatnot. And then they're like, they hit 30s and they realize that, they have very little in common with their parents, with their sort of like original culture, with where they come from a few generations ago. And they feel that, there's something missing. And quite a lot of them are telling us that, this watch is maybe for them a way to sort of reconnect. So we were super happy to hear that, like very, very touching, very, very moving kind of story. But then we also have a lot of simply like non-Chinese related at all collectors. And those guys, when we talk to them, we feel that the main driver is really the novelty. So it's often the same profiles. Like they have a lot of watches at very different price points. Like they have all the mainstream, like Rolex. They have their Pateks. They really have everything that. Yeah, everything. And then they want like unique stuff. They want things that they have not seen before, that they don't have. And the reason why they get our watches is really that's the driver. Like they're like, oh, well, I don't have a premium Chinese watch. I didn't know this existed. I didn't know you could do like guilloche by hand in China. That's therefore interesting to me. So I'll get one. And yeah, so a lot of our customers as well like have this kind of line of thoughts. And then when we dig into what they have in their collection, they also get those Corona watches and Ming watches and Anno Day, like really like watches that are like very uniquely positioned, heavy on storytelling, highly differentiated concepts. A lot of work on the dial. So those are the community.
Very interesting. And I'm glad that you talked about the non-Chinese buyer, because I'm not Chinese, and I really enjoyed the first model. I haven't seen the follow-up model yet, but I think for me, pretty much every serious culture that has history in this world has some beauty in it. And if someone is investigating that culture, knows watches, then they can find something beautiful from that culture and bring it into watches. And that's always such a satisfying thing. And on the European side, we have beauty from the English culture, from the French culture, from the Swiss culture, of course, the Italian culture, the German culture, in their watches. And it's their culture in this, timepiece form, and it's beautiful. And of course, China is going to have plenty of things to borrow from. So for me, I think at the very least, it's a curiosity as to what you can discover. Talk a little bit about the artistic process of how difficult it is to take that aesthetic and then to turn it into decoration on a watch so that the watch doesn't become kitsch or silly or not serious.
Yeah, no, that's really one of the biggest difficulties, because in a way you don't want to be figurative, but rather you want to find concepts that can be worked around and then applied to the watch as a kind of like format or canvas. And that's really hard. And that's why you need to have this really like deep cultural understanding, because otherwise, well, you'll take Chinese numbers and you'll place them on the dial, or you'll put a dragon or whatnot and red and gold. So for us, it's really like, okay, so we define an overall theme, and then within that theme, we look for those kind of like wider like cultural concepts. And then we just think about, okay, how can this be applied to a watch? How can we take this line of thinking and apply it to the watch? I know it sounds very abstract, but I'm going to give you an example. So our current line, like Perception, the red thread of it is traditional Chinese architecture, and we identified this very interesting principle, which is called Sunmao. So Sunmao is an ancient building principle which consisted in making large buildings without any nails or glues, and simply speaking, they would imbricate the elements into one another. And so we took that and we applied it to how we build the dial. So if you take our dial, you have a dial base on which you have like indexes which are on it, and then those indexes actually insert themselves into another dial which is guilloched, and then within those indexes you have like a chapter ring which is locking itself in them. So everything is like imbricated into one another. And for us, like that was like a cool and nice way to take this old cultural principle and to apply it to the watch.
Have you made any mistakes in terms of some designs and things like that, where you thought that you were incorporating the proper aesthetic and it turned out that you messed it up or you did it wrong? I'm just wondering, again, you spend a lot of time there, but there's always risks, right, in translating wrong.
No, I just don't think we've made enough watches yet, but I don't think we made mistakes per se, but it's more like how thoughtful are the things that we do. And I feel that if we were to look back at when we started versus now, at the beginning, things were much more literal. Whereas now, I believe there's simply like more thinking involved in the design. So you look at our first watch, Porcelain Odyssey. In those subdials, like we wanted to pay homage to ancient time-telling system of China, and we simply put the characters for like certain hours within that. It was not functional; it was more like as a visual thing. And I believe that it was interesting, but it was much less thoughtful than the example I just gave you about like the Sunmao construction principle. So yeah, no mistake per se, but just like an evolution of the creativity and the thoughtfulness involved in those dials and watches.
That makes sense. I want to talk a little bit about branding as well as some cultural messages that can be best communicated as marketing statements. And I'm thinking about, of course, the Swiss, as well as the Japanese for that matter, who when you think about the values that go into their watches, you can articulate a bunch of specific things that they're trying to do with it. They're trying to make things perfectly fit together, or certain high levels of value, precious materials, accuracy. In Switzerland, heritage and doing things the same way for a long time is valued. And my question is, as you build out a brand that has the celebration of sort of Chinese culture and heritage and some of the lessons, what are some of the things that you are able to start saying, right? As you build the brand personality, do you use a bunch of statements for Confucius? I'm just, you know what I mean? How do you build more of a theme around what it means when you look deeper than just Chinese culture?
Yeah, no, but that's a really tough one. In a sense, it's how do you build your kind of identity, but from a very sort of macro lens, not just the identity of your watches or even of your brand, but more okay, what made in China could mean. And I think it's also part of what is exciting, that there is no image or no sort of mind space of what could be a Chinese identity. As you correctly say, Swiss is all about heritage, and Japan is all about the meticulousness and how everything fits so well together and nothing is left to chance. But for China, I mean, you ask most people and you sort of forget all those nasty comments about made in China, and then I believe it's pretty hard to get an idea of what is modern Chinese style. What are the key traits and the key drivers and trends so I would say that this is something that we're trying to build, I mean, at least at our very small scale, but it's obviously always a work in progress on our end. What we're trying to do is really to play a lot always with the craft and to try to incorporate them in a modern way. So sort of having this bridge between the past and the present. We're also playing a lot with perceptions, depth, reflections, all those kind of optical impressions that plays a big part in our design. And I feel that if you were to look at Chinese art, there's often the symmetry, the verticality, the depth are key themes that always tend to reappear. So we try to have those in our watches. But then as to, for the sort of grander question, of what modern Chinese style is or can be, this, unfortunately, I can't give you an answer just yet. I hope that maybe in 10 years I can be okay, so we contributed to building it, and this is what it is. But it's still a work in progress.
I'm glad you're thinking about it. I mean, again, as I said, it's a hard question. And if you ask most Swiss brands, they won't even be able to tell you, even though it's the same thing as their 5 competitors. So it is a hard thing. But as the concept of the brand evolves, and there will be more companies that like Atelier when you will have more competitors. And I think as that happens, there'll be more statements made. I have heard that unlike cities in Europe where you are raised around a bunch of beautiful old things, whether it's architecture or statues or art in museums, in not all, but many places in Asia, you don't necessarily have as much old structures and things to admire for a variety of reasons, but the cities are, either maybe more modern or contemporary, and that has something to do with sort of aesthetic preferences, especially where, if you grow up in Paris, a beautiful city, like, you just know what beautiful things look like because you've been around it. Talk a little bit about how that may have an impact, or maybe even a negative impact, on the ability for Chinese people to even recognize their own culture if, as what I hear is true, they don't actually see a lot of it around them.
Well, I'm not sure this is like 100% like true. Like, it's true that cities are mostly modern, even though it's very hard to make like some general statements about that. What is true is that, well, the country has changed tremendously in the past 30 years. When it opened, like, yeah, it has been changing and it's still changing very quickly. So cities that once were like very small or even villages became like sprawling, like urban centers with a lot of like skyscrapers, a lot of like ancient buildings were destroyed or maybe relocated. But not everything. Like, there's a lot that has been conserved, that there's a lot that is still there, and there has been a lot of effort to preserve this heritage and this patrimony. So I'm not so sure the environment itself like has that big of an impact. But then, like, not being born and raised in China and not having lived through those years of changes, it's a bit hard for me to put myself in those shoes. If I were to look at my own background, well, I'm not from Paris. I'm from Marseille, and Marseille is not a city with a lot of monuments. It's a city that was
not like Paris.
It was once famously known for the drug traffic, but that's pretty much it. So I wouldn't say that I was born like surrounded by beauty. I mean, Paris is really a museum city. Like, one building out of two is a monument. You live in a museum. Marseille, not really, but still, like that didn't really have much of an impact. I don't know. I feel this whole thing is more about like the curiosity to explore, to discover, and then the willingness to share this beauty, but less the fact of having been like raised in beauty, if that makes any sense. And I feel this curiosity, you can have it everywhere, honestly.
I just think it's interesting because most of the time, I think when there's someone making a new watch brand in China, it's actually a futuristic design. And what's actually refreshing and nice is you've taken essentially the European approach to design and you've just shifted the focus from one culture to another. And that translated to something nice. And maybe it took sort of a European person to do that, but no one until now has added that level, that specific type of branding to a Chinese-themed watch, even though there are, as you said, plenty of other, very admirable Chinese watch brands.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Maybe also, I don't know, maybe this interest for like heritage is a very European thing. But also, I think like what was a lot at play here is that when I went to China, like I went there as a foreigner. So to me, it was all new. And therefore, like, I had this kind of endeavor of really like paying attention and exploring and really looking at all those things. Whereas I feel that, okay, maybe if I had been Chinese, like all those things would have been sort of the normal environment, and you don't necessarily look at them this much. So when I first went there, I mean, I knew nothing about the country, and therefore it was all like new discoveries. And maybe this is what like made us like fall so much in love with what we saw, because it was like a brand new thing, and we went there with the mindset, or at least I went there with the mindset of like, discovering and learning. I feel sometimes, the same can even apply to like foreigners going to Europe versus like locals. I'm in Paris, and there's a lot of sites and museums, and even the Eiffel Tower that I've never been to because I take those stuff for granted, and they're part of the normal environment. I've never been to the Louvre. I've never been to any of the big museums. It's just like, those normal things around me. Whereas like when foreigners come here, they have this endeavor, this behavior of like really discovering the local environment, and they discover all the stuff. So maybe it has to do with being a foreigner and going there to learn and explore. And maybe this is what maybe made me so sensitive about the local culture.
I mean, it's
maybe.
a good thing. I mean, look, I look sometimes at the Japanese fashion interest in certain American things, and sometimes I feel like the Japanese designers understand American culture better than the Americans, or at least they can, in sort of a small amount of time, make something that feels like the culture came from the culture and is beautiful. And so I think sometimes these third-party observers or curators or creatives, they're able to see something academically, whereas when you live it, when you're in it, it's too much a part of your identity to think about it sort of from in an academic standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. This I agree. I think, yeah, this is the point I was sort of trying to make. But
Yeah.
I think it's nice that you mentioned, like, yeah, those Japanese designers who then like become really like focused and almost obsessed about like certain aspects of our culture that we may not even know about, and who then
with
like
French
really,
culture as well.
yeah,
They're very interested.
yeah, actually, in Paris, there's like quite a few like restaurants which are serving French food, and actually like very high-end French food, and the chefs are Japanese, and those are like Japanese chefs who became like really passionate about that, and who went to really like refine their skills like really heavily in French food, and yeah, I feel like, yeah, being a foreigner, you have a different viewpoint, and you may develop a different sort of appreciation that locals may not have like intuitively.
Now, you told me that the last couple of years you had to change your business structure a little bit. Some of your team had to move, and now you're a little bit distributed. Where do you go from here? I mean, we're going towards an uncertain future for sure. But I think what is certain is that people like watches. I believe that people will continue to like watches. You have your brand and you have opportunity. What do you do in the coming years? What are the right steps?
Yeah, I think we want to really stick to our prime mission, which is celebrating Chinese culture and craftsmanship. And for us, the way of doing so is by making watches which, in a way, can be quote unquote like increasingly ambitious watches that, I don't know, incorporate like more craft, or which design is even more refined, even more like so thoughtful. That's kind of like the grand direction that we want to follow. Yeah, so in a sense, it's making like increasingly nicer / like more interesting watches. And for us, yeah, one of the ways of doing so is having more like handcrafted elements. I think that by sort of like sticking to that, hopefully we can then like continue to exist and to grow over the coming years. There's no sort of like odd plans of venturing into other verticals or doing different concepts. Like, no, we have this kind of like red thread that we want to follow. I think there's really a lot of explore in China. What we've done so far is almost nothing. There's so many crafts, so many like cultural themes, yeah, so many cool stuff to show to the world and to celebrate. Yeah, that's what we'll keep on doing.
Does that mean the trajectory of increasing the price point is probably going to continue? Because what I hear is that you want to have sort of a modest level of production, but to make that make sense, you sort of need to move increasingly high end, which also coincides with the desire to have more craftsmanship. Is that part of the strategy, or are you aggressively trying to stay in a certain price zone?
No, I think it will like gradually increase, a little bit, not tremendously. I mean, my goal is not to be the Patek of China. That's not the goal. But yeah, naturally, I believe like prices will gradually increase a little bit because there will be more and more crafts, but the value element will still be there. So I'm not gonna like next year like hike by 2x the price of our existing watches just because there's demand and less supply. That's not the goal, but yeah, maybe we'll have like a more ambitious watch with, let's say, I don't know, hand finish movement and hand finish case and whatnot. And obviously that will come a little bit more expensive. But I think that for the price we will offer, this will be like a tremendous value. And not something that you can find at these price points. But the price increase is not like necessarily like a necessity. Like, who knows, we may find like other cool and interesting craft, and those may not be that expensive, and therefore like the watches wouldn't necessarily be like that more expensive. So yeah, I think it's likely it will happen, but it's not a necessity per se. And the value will stay there. Like, yeah.
Right. Of course. The perception models cost a few times as the original Porcelain Odyssey collection. And my question is, were you able to sell to some of the same people, or at the higher price point, did you find that you had to sell to a different consumer demographic?
No, some people stayed with us. The ones that were like very novelty driven, I think that their sensitivity to price, at least within this bracket, was not really relevant. So those people stayed with us, but then like the collectors were maybe a bit more like price sensitive, who joined us at the Kickstarter phase. Those guys didn't really follow. I think that by initially launching on Kickstarter back in 2018, we also appealed to more like value/price driven crowd, and for them already our watch was quite expensive, because I mean in a sense it's still like quite a bit of money. You know, it was like $500 at pre-order, and then 720. I mean, it's easy to kind of get the feeling that it's not a lot, because we see watches costing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands.
It is.
But in actual facts, it's still like a lot of money. I mean, in France, it's more than half of like the sort of like minimum like monthly salary. So it's definitely a lot of money. So for them, I feel okay. They really like the watch, but it was maybe like the max of what they could spend, like budget-wise. So of course, when we increased like it was $2,000 for the pre-order of Perception, that was way too high for them, understandably. But the others like were maybe less price sensitive. Those ones followed us, and then we had also a new kind of crowd who beforehand maybe liked the concept but thought it was too cheap, because obviously selling the watches at $700, you have to make concessions. You have to be very mindful of your production costs, and there are things that we couldn't do at this price point. So those guys didn't join us before, but now that the watch was a bit more premium, they could, they were certainly more interested in the product.
Does it at all concern you that if you further increase price points, you'll have to spend that much more effort on branding and customer acquisition? Or at this point in the game, do you feel confident that you understand the consumer and the market, and that if you give them more watch, they will understand what you're trying to do and reward you with their dollars because they're getting that much more out of the bargain?
I think that there's a bit of both. Like, yes, as you increase prices, usually you have to do a bit more effort to sell the watches. But then it's really like, it really goes down to how you increase the prices and what is the value. You know, like I feel that if tomorrow we were releasing, I don't know, a mechanical perpetual calendar for 15,000, it would be a huge increase, but it would be like a tremendous value. And I believe that the customer acquisition costs actually wouldn't be so high. So there's really two components. If we look back at how much we are spending marketing-wise to sell the Porcelain Odyssey versus the Perception, it's actually like cheaper to sell a Perception than the Porcelain Odyssey, because I also feel that the product is kind of like more interesting, more finished, more.
It's a cool watch. It's really cool.
It's more cool, you know. It's like more absolute in a way. In what we wanted to achieve, there's less concessions, and I also feel that maybe the value is more there. So I believe that as long as we keep the value and obviously, I mean, if we go to ridiculous prices, that would be another job. But if we keep the value and stay somewhat reasonable, it should be hopefully okay.
That makes sense. My final question really has to do with movements. A lot of mechanical movements are made in China. So far, you've had, pretty simple three-hand automatics. But you have, in addition to this heritage of craftsmanship, there's movement makers and things like that in China. Are you exploring things beyond three-hand watches? Are you trying to do new things? I'm just curious where your mind goes when it comes to the mechanics or the insides and your own taste, as well as how you can integrate that into Chinese culture.
No, very, very fair. It's actually like an important topic for us those days. So, I mean, to answer the first question, yes, we're looking at other things like beyond simply freehanders. We are working on a chronograph. We're working on a few other things. But then like we have this sort of like general consideration about the fact that if you look at like the current supply of Chinese movements, there's a lot in the sort of like low-end spectrums. There's a lot in the maybe like mid-end spectrum, but then beyond that, there is nothing. So I think that the movement that we use in perception is probably like the highest end movement, automatic, like freehanders that you can find in mainland China. And then we're thinking, okay, like, what if we keep on upping the standard of everything else? We have like increasingly cooler dials. We use like very cool craft for the case. But what happens if we cannot improve the movement? And then we're a bit afraid that there may be a gap between the rest of the watch and the movement. So to this end, we're actually working on developing a new base caliber that would be in tune as well with the positioning that we want to have and what we want to achieve. So it's not a complication. It's not like some weird features. It's really just a base caliber, but with much higher end specifications. So 120 hours power reserve, very thin, very efficient auto winding, silicon escapement, free sprung, and those kind of stuff to have a really like high end base caliber that can be tuned with what we will be doing in the future.
That's very interesting. And would it ever be weird to have a non-Chinese movement in there, like having a movement from Japan or Switzerland?
Yeah.
Even? Is that weird?
This wouldn't work because our whole like rhetoric is to say that we really believe in made in China and we want to celebrate culture and craftsmanship. And I think, if we were to have like a Swiss or Japanese movement inside, then our story wouldn't be coherent. On the one hand, we say we really believe in 100% made there, and on the other hand, we have a Swiss movement because there's nothing "quote unquote" good enough in China. So no, we cannot. And honestly, I believe that we could have this like high-end caliber made in China. It's just that maybe so far there was no demand for that, but that's not to say that there's no capability or skills to make it. And now we believe that we can have the demand for that. So we are developing it.
That's very interesting. Robin, where can people learn more about yourself and the Atelier Wen brand on the internet?
Super easy. They can just go on our website, which is atelierwen.com, and on our Instagram, and they can also join our WhatsApp group. So we have a big WhatsApp group with collectors and people from our community. So they can join that. They just need to send us a message like via our website, and they get the invite.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been the Superlative Podcast with Robin Tallendier, co-founder of Atelier Wen. Robin, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ariel. That was really nice. So thanks so much for having me there. Really had a good time chatting with you.
Likewise. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Superlative Podcast. This show relies on support from you, the audience. Please subscribe, review, and share Superlative with your friends. To get the latest watch news and enthusiast commentary, also listen to the Blog to Watch Weekly podcast. For show ideas, comments, or business, please contact us at podcasts@blogtowatch.com.